superb debate coming up here because a surge of migrant boats are expected to descend on the Italian island of Lampedusa once again. Strong winds have prevented migrant boat arrivals for the past 8 days, but 3 boats landed on the island yesterday. And this comes after more than 11,000 migrants arrived on the island in under 1 week. Well, joining me now is international human rights lawyer David Haye, a great friend of the show, as is the director for the Centre of Migration and Economic Prosperity, Stephen Woolfe. Let's start with you, Woolfe. Meloni pledged to stop the boats in Italy. She's not only failed, but numbers have more than doubled. Should we be concerned in Britain?
I think we should be concerned in Britain because obviously whatever numbers come into the European Union through its southern and western crisis points where most of the migrants come in, many do make it over to the United Kingdom. After all, we are one of the 4 countries, Germany, Italy, France and the UK, that takes 75% of most of the economic migrants and illegal migrants that come into the European Union. And Giorgia Meloni has vowed, again with strong language, that Italy will not become the migrant wasteland for the EU. But unfortunately, she's failing to achieve what this government is doing and stopping the boats from coming into Italy.
OK, one of the things, over to you, David Haye, that Meloni has proposed is a deportation decree to illegals who lie about their age or are a threat to national security. My simple question to you, David, is how on earth do you prove either of those things? I mean, for example, if you try and prove an asylum seeker's age, the human rights people say you can't do that, you can't take dental records, you're not allowed to do anything there. And how do you find out if somebody is a threat to national security if they are undocumented?
Hi, good afternoon. Well, you can't, essentially. That's the thing. And, you know, if many of your viewers and listeners remember back in the Arab Spring around 2011, we saw all of this before. We saw deals with basically dictators in North Africa. We saw promises of stopping boats and deporting people. None of it happened. And a decade later, it's the same promises, different politicians. And it's the same thing, that the problem that we have here in the channel. These things aren't effective and or can't be done. And that's exactly what you're seeing over in Lampedusa at the moment.
And Stephen Woolfe, when you look at the numbers, as I said, 133,000 illegals have arrived on Italy's shores in 1 year alone, compared to 108,000 in the UK since 2018, when we first started measuring the dinghies arriving on the Channel coast. So this is a huge number. But let's not forget, Meloni was elected to power on the pledge of stopping the boats. First, she said she's sending a naval blockade. She declared a state of emergency in July. Stephen, is it a depressing reality that no matter how tough politicians talk, including our own, like King Canute, they are powerless to stop this tide? Stephen Woolfe's just gone. Let's put that to David Haye. David, did you hear the question?
I did, Martin. I think it's very interesting when you look at that, because those promises are a lot of the things that you see the more extreme politicians that we have here saying what we should be doing in the Channel. And if they're not working in Italy, I think that's fairly good evidence that they won't be working here either. And so, again, more ideas that simply won't work. And that's why, I mean, earlier the week I actually applauded. It took the odd step of applauding Suella Braverman for some of the comments that she made and the fact that she brought that to an international stage. But yeah, it won't work.
Are you back with us, Stephen Woolfe?
Well, I thought I was hit there.
OK, so let me put that question. Let me put that question to you again. When you look at the numbers, 133,000 have arrived in Italy. Meloni threatened to send in a naval blockade. She also declared a state of emergency in July. None of that has done a single thing. In fact, numbers have gone through the roof. Is she powerless to stop this in the same way Rishi Sunak is?
I think they're powerless and they're whistling in the wind, most of the European Union politicians who strike very strong language, as we've seen here, but actually are not really enacting anything of strength and force because they are restricted by their membership of the European Union, which is controlled by European Union commissioners and other politicians in the Parliament that will do whatever they can to link in with those same similar types of non-governmental organisations and similar people in the legal services that will try and find laws to prevent them from acting tough. And the reality is there's been over 1 million people coming into the EU from all the different border areas, 80% increase coming in from the Polish side into Germany, that Germany is threatening to close its borders for non-Schengen business. So you have this big issue, but this has been going on for so long in Europe. Since 2014, when you had the Syria crisis and over 2.5 million people went to Germany. That is a huge cost to Germany. It's over 10 billion euros a year. The EU has spent massively in our research, well over 110 billion euros, 110 billion euros in a 10-year process dealing with illegal migration, or what they call irregular migration. It's not stopping, it's carrying on, and until they decide to have something really strong between the countries and stop being wishy-washy about how they deal with it, this will continue.
And David, what do you make of Suella Braverman's comments this week in terms of illegal immigration? She calls an existential threat to the West, and she hit out at multiculturalism. How helpful do you think those kinds of comments are? David?
So I'm sorry. I was, I applauded a lot of what she said, but also I think those particular parts of the speech, I don't think they're very helpful. I applauded a lot of what she said about, bringing it to a global stage, that we need to address it on a global level. And that's one of the things that I think was very, very good. Her comments about multiculturalism, I don't think they're helpful. As you know, I'm not very much a fan of pretty much most of what she said or done in the past. But I think there were very good elements of the speech, and particularly when she touched on the issues with applicants that are claiming or are LGBTQ and what countries they come from. There was a very, very grown-up conversation that needs to be had in that area. And I saw obviously that she and myself as supporting her came in for an awful lot of negative comments.
To both of you, but first to Stephen Woolfe, a key date on the horizon is October the 9th, when we're expecting the finding from the Supreme Court, of course, to the Rwanda deportation scheme to be announced. Stephen Woolfe, how do you think that will go?
Oh, well, I think that's balanced on a knife edge. It's really difficult to assess it. Generally, I think in legal terms, there is a lot of scope for the government to be successful in this particular application. My feelings is that the Supreme Court may rule against it and try and push more narrower points, saying it's got to be related solely to the individual, as the lower courts have suggested. And therefore, you're almost trying to find legislation to deal with an individual by individual basis, which will be a total failure of the scheme. But when you come to Suella Braverman, she's not the only one that's suggesting that large-scale illegal migration is impacting negatively this country. Joseph Borrell, who is EU's external commissioner, has said, and I quote, that migration could be a dissolving force for the European Union. We've had other senior EU commissioners saying that the mass migration coming into the EU could actually lead to its end, and it is a disaster. So the question people have to ask, once again, always is, we need to be kind and generous to those people genuinely fleeing, but you also have to be honest. If we're not going to stop it, this is what's going to happen to your country and the European Union as a whole. That discussion also needs to be had, and Suella Braverman at least began to deal with that in her speech.
And David Haye, in terms of that October 9th ruling, it's going to be central to the next general election pledge for sure. If the Supreme Court finds against the government, if the Rwanda plan is blocked, do you fear that we could be heading for almost a repeat of the showdown between the legal system and the government that we saw during Brexit? And if that happens, how damaging could that be?
I think I do, and I think the government also are a bit worried about what the judgment may be, because we saw the sabre rattling about the ECHR. It was almost like a battle cry, and not that. And so there's a reason that was put out, I think, into the public, and I do think it's highly possible that it could go against the government. Now, if that happens, then we're looking at the likes of the ECHR stepping in. I don't think, even if it goes in favour of the government, that we're going to see anyone going on planes any time soon. So it will go down to the ECHR, and then it's ahead of a coming general election. So I think you'll see a lot of electioneering and around that point.
Even if we get to that point, where the Supreme Court gets in the way of the government. And don't forget that every election since 2010, the public has voted to take back control of our borders. Are we going to be heading, do you think, for an almighty face-off? And politically, what does it mean for the Conservative Party if they lose? Will this be everyone's against us? The only way to stop this is to vote Conservative. And might actually that help them in the next general election if they say the entire system is rigged against the will of the people?
I think what's going to happen is people are going to feel fed up with the whole idea that voting and being a member of the electorate and a democracy actually works. If they see that the Conservative Party have failed to achieve a policy that they've put out in their own papers before the general election and it didn't go ahead, then people are going to say, what's the point of voting? And to a certain extent, the elites want that. They don't want us to really have a true democracy where the people vote like they did in Brexit. They want to have little camps that are in control of things. But it will be a disaster. It'll be a disaster for the Conservatives. It'll be a disaster for any policy of trying to control migration in the United Kingdom. And I think it'll also be a very sad day for our legal system. As a junior lawyer growing up, I never really enjoyed the idea of the ECHR. I couldn't understand why our common law system, which worked tremendously well, linked positively with what was then our own highest courts in the land, now being usurped by one in a different country, worked well with our own politics. That was a disaster at the time. Connecting of the Human Rights Act to an extent was. I just believe we had a better way of dealing with it with our own common law system. It will be a failure, and I think it will be a disaster morally for the country.
David Haye, presumably you're a supporter of the ECHR as an international human rights lawyer. Would you welcome a referendum on the topic?
I've made it very clear I don't think we should come out. And I see that, we are going to... This is one of the things that I think the next election is going to be fought on. And if the government loses, and if this ends up in the ECHR, which is quite possible, I think you can very much see a big divide in or out. And a referendum, I think, would be certainly, if we have to, the fairest way to go forward.
OK, David Haye and Stephen Woolfe, we have to leave it there. Thank you. An excellent debate.